How far would you go to protect those you love, even when your freedom is at stake? Summary of the book, Island Beneath the Sea, by Isabel Allende. Part 1. The Beginning of Slavery. Zarité was born in Saint-Domingue, where the earth is mixed with the blood and sweat of those who do not even own their own bodies. For as long as she can remember, her life has been work under the relentless sun of the Antilles, where sugar, the sweet gold that feeds the French Empire, is an invisible chain that binds thousands of souls to an existence of suffering. Saint-Domingue, an island once called Haiti by its first inhabitants, has been transformed into a hell by European colonists, who brought slaves from Africa to exploit the land until it was exhausted. Slaves, like Zarité, were considered little more than beasts of burden, tools of flesh and blood, destined to work tirelessly on the plantations. Zarité was only 9 years old when she was sold. Her childhood, brief and marked by fear and uncertainty, ended the day a merchant handed her over to her new master, Toulouse Valmorain. He was a young Frenchman who had come to the island to take over the plantation his father had left behind. Valmorain was not a brutal man on the surface, but his coldness and the indifference with which he handled the lives of those who belonged to him revealed a far more subtle cruelty. To him, Zarité was just one of the many slaves who passed through his estate, a girl whose existence he barely registered, except when she served him some practical function. Zarité's life on the Valmorain plantation was a grueling routine of physical labor and abuse. Yet, deep inside, something remained intact, her connection to her African roots. The drums of Dahomey resonated in her veins, even though the whites forbade such music. In silence, when the lights in the big house went out and only the moon remained to illuminate the world, Zarité danced. Her body, aching from work, found relief in movement, in the secret rhythm that only she could hear. It was in those moments, in the solitude of the night, that she felt free. Even though her feet trod the soil of Saint-Domingue, her spirit flew to places where shackles did not exist. The sugar plantation was a daily battlefield. The slaves, exhausted and abused, were constantly watched by the foremen, cruel men who maintained control through fear and violence. Most feared of all was Prosper Cambrai, the head foreman, whose name struck terror into the workers. With his whip in hand and his cold eyes, Cambrai did not hesitate to punish anyone who showed signs of resistance. Despite her young age, Zarité quickly learned not to attract Cambrai's attention. She knew that survival on the plantation depended on invisibility, doing what was asked of her, without questions, without defiant glances. This was how her resistance was forged, a silent strength that would keep her going for years to come. Over time, Zarité became an indispensable part of the Valmorain household. Not only did she work in the fields, but she also served in the big house, tending to her master and the guests who passed through the plantation. It was a life of constant exhaustion, with no real moments of rest. But even in the midst of that oppression, Zarité kept a small spark of hope alive, a hope that came to her in the form of stories about rebellion and freedom. Rumors of slaves who had escaped to the mountains, of those who had managed to rebel against their masters, spread through the fields like the wind. Zarité listened to these stories with a mixture of fear and fascination, wondering if one day she too could be free. The figure of her mother, an African woman she had never met, would appear in her dreams like an echo of her past. In those dreams, Zarité saw herself dancing in a drum circle, surrounded by people who shared her blood. That spiritual connection to her African heritage was what kept her strong, reminding her that even though her body belonged to others, her spirit could not be captured. As she grew older, that inner strength became more apparent. Even though she continued to do Valmorain's bidding, deep inside, Zarité was forging her own destiny. Over time, Valmorain began to see in Zarité something more than just a slave. The young woman had grown up under his roof, and although he would never admit it, he depended on her more than he would like. It was she who kept the house in order, who looked after his son Maurice, who made sure everything ran smoothly in his absence. Valmorain used her in every aspect of his life, but he never treated her as a complete person. To him, Zarité was just an extension of the plantation, another cog in the machinery that provided him with wealth and power. But Zarité knew that her life was more than that. Although her body was chained to the plantation, her mind was still free, dancing to the rhythm of the drums that no one else could hear. The years passed and slavery was still her daily reality. But in Zaríté's heart, the fight for freedom grew. She knew that someday, somehow, she would find a way to escape, to dance in the land of freedom she so longed for. And in the meantime, she would continue to resist in silence, as she had always done, dancing in the darkness, waiting for the moment when she could dance under the sun as a free woman. Part 2. The Coming of the Rebellion. Zarité, or Teta, took an even darker turn when she was forced to share the bed of Toulouse Valmorain, the same man who had bought her as another object on the slave market. Although she had managed to stay away from the worst abuses in her early years on the plantation, Valmorain soon made her his concubine, forcing her to surrender under the shadow of his power. Zarité had no choice but to submit, but a silent rage grew within her. Every night she spent with Valmorain, she felt something inside her die a little more. However, the young mulatto woman, hardened by adversity since her childhood, learned to contain her pain and hide her despair under a facade of calm. Shortly after, Zarité became pregnant. For Valmorain, it was an insignificant event, a bastard child that would not change his life at all. But for Zarité, the arrival of her daughter Rosette meant a new chain. Rosette, the product of violence and oppression, would be born into a world where her destiny, like that of her mother, was already sealed by slavery. Even so, Zarité could not help but love her daughter. From the moment she held her in her arms, she knew that she would do anything to protect her, even if it meant continuing to endure Valmorain's abuse. In addition to raising Rosette, Zarité took care of Maurice, the legitimate son of Valmorain and his wife, who often treated her with contempt. But Zarité cared for him with the same dedication as she did her own daughter. Through it all, Valmorain trusted Zarité completely to raise Maurice and keep the household in order. Their relationship was marked by the brutality of power, but also by a silent dependence. Although he would never admit it, Valmorain needed Zarité not only for everyday tasks, but also to keep his own guilt and emotional collapse at bay. As tensions rose on the island, slaves began to rebel against their masters. The air was filled with rumors of uprisings and escapes, stories of men and women escaping into the mountains to join the Maroons, fighting for their freedom. Zarité heard these murmurs in the barracks, her fellow slaves whispering of the hope of a future without shackles. Though she didn't say it out loud, in her heart, Zarité dreamed of that day too. The rebellion finally reached the Valmorain plantation like an unstoppable storm. The slaves, tired of years of abuse, set fire to the cane fields. The flames lit up the night sky as the sound of war drums echoed in the distance. Zarité, in the midst of the chaos, knew that this moment had come. Her instinct was to flee, but she couldn't do it alone. Maurice, her master's son, needed her, and even though she despised him inside, she couldn't abandon him. And Rosette, her daughter, tied her even more tightly to this cursed place. With smoke enveloping the plantation, Valmorain, desperate to save what was left of his empire, ordered an evacuation. Zarité, firm and resolute, made sure that Rosette and Maurice were safe, while the screams of the slaves and the barking of the overseer's dogs echoed through the night. Valmorain fled with what little he could take, and Zarité, loyal by obligation, accompanied him. Despite the horrors she had lived through, at that moment, she saw no other option. The plantation, that prison that had kept her trapped for so many years, burned to the ground. As they fled Saint-Domingue, Zarité's world was crumbling along with the plantation. The system that had sustained life on the island for generations was crumbling, and with it, the old order of masters and slaves. Zarité could feel it. Change was in the air. Though she was still a slave, something inside her had changed forever. The fire had destroyed not only the plantation, but also the invisible chains that had kept her bound. Now, more than ever, freedom felt like a real possibility. Part 3. Loss and Betrayal. Having learned to survive in the shadows, she found herself in an increasingly untenable situation. Although Toulouse Valmorain relied on her more, both for the management of the house and for the care of their son Maurice and daughter Rosette, he never failed to remind her that she was still a slave. His control over her was a constant reminder that her freedom was not something she could easily obtain. Every day, Zarité was torn between her role as the family's caretaker and her growing desire to break free, not only for herself, but also for Rosette, whose life was trapped in the same cycle of slavery. The days passed like an endless succession of tasks and abuses. First, she had endured the scorn of Eugenia, Valmoraine's first wife, who, on the verge of madness, unloaded her frustration and pain on Zarité. After Eugenia's death, the second mistress arrived, Hortense Gazot, a younger and more arrogant woman, who from the beginning treated Zarité as an enemy, using the whip on the slaves of the house without any remorse. Hortense, far from being a submissive wife, dedicated herself to imposing her authority with cruelty, eliminating the servants she did not like and relegating Zarité to the hardest tasks. Life in the Valmoraine house had become a power game, in which Hortense moved the pieces as she pleased, punishing the slaves for any transgression, real or imagined. Zarité tried to stay strong, clinging to her love for her children and to the small joys she found in her memories. But the days of service seemed to drag on forever, and the uncertainty about Rosette's future ate away at her inside. The girl, who had grown up without knowing the true nature of her condition, believed that Valmoraine's love would protect her. Zarité knew that this illusion would not last, and that sooner or later her daughter would face the harsh reality of slavery. Although Valmoraine had promised her freedom, Zarité knew that the promises of the masters were worth little. Zarité's internal conflict reached a critical point when tensions between Maurice and his father increased. Maurice, influenced by the abolitionist ideas he had heard at school, began to question the system in which he had grown up. To him, slavery was an immorality he could not accept, and his love for Rosette, his unacknowledged sister, only complicated matters. Valmoraine, seeing the affection between Maurice and Rosette, attempted to control the situation with his characteristic coldness, suggesting that Maurice simply take Rosette as a mistress and then forget her. But Maurice rebelled, confronting his father and declaring that he could not accept that reality. To him, Rosette was not just a slave, but a person with rights and dignity. Zarité watched this struggle from the sidelines, knowing that even though Maurice was on her side, his words would not change the structure that kept them all trapped. Hortense, for her part, saw Rosette as a threat, suspecting that the relationship between Maurice and the young woman was deeper than Valmoraine wanted to admit. In this tense atmosphere, Zarité continued to fulfill her duties, but it became more difficult to remain calm every day. The house had become a trap, and the walls seemed to close in on her. She knew something had to change, but she could not imagine how to escape the control Valmoraine exerted over her life and that of her children. The future of Zarité and Rosette hung in the balance. Every day, the situation on the plantation grew more tense, and the violence spreading across the island began to draw closer. The rebellions that rocked Saint-Domingue were a constant reminder that the balance of power could shift at any moment. But for Zarité, the real conflict was within. She knew she had to protect Rosette, but she didn't see how to do so without sacrificing the little she had achieved so far. The fight for freedom was not only fought on the battlefields, but also in the hearts of those who, like Zarité, dreamed of a different future, even if it seemed impossible to achieve. Part 4. The final confrontation with freedom. The crowning moment in Zarité's life came after years of uncertainty, pain, and servitude. After a long internal conflict, Valmoraine, overwhelmed by the pressure of the rebellions sweeping through Saint-Domingue and the collapse of his plantation, finally relented and granted Zarité her freedom. It was a gesture forced by circumstance, not compassion, and while seemingly an act of redemption, it was fraught with bitterness. Zarité, after years of silent service, had dreamed of this moment, but when it came under a cloud of pain, for her daughter Rosette was still chained to the cruel rules of the world in which they lived. Valmoraine, weakened by both the war and the burden of his own guilt, had no choice but to accede to Sancho and Père Antoine's demand to sign Zarité's emancipation papers. Zarité's freedom was sealed with a document that the judge solemnly signed while she waited, soul in suspense, in front of the tribunal. No one came forward to object to her release, not even Hortense, Valmoraine's wife, who could have accused her of any pretext to prevent it. Zarité was not yet completely free. Not all Rosette remained a slave. Despite her newfound freedom, she felt the invisible chain that continued to bind her to Valmoraine, for she could not abandon her daughter. The act of liberation, however, was more symbolic than real. In her hands, Zarité held the paper that proclaimed her free, but that freedom had limits. With chaos and war engulfing the island, Valmoraine still depended on Zarité more than ever, and she knew she could not simply walk away, not with Rosette still caught in the webs of fate. Valmoraine's decision to emancipate Zarité was not out of compassion or regret, but a desperate measure to ease tensions within her household. Even after her release, however, Zarité continued to serve Valmoraine, for the revolution rocking Saint-Domingue made it unthinkable for her to leave at that moment. Zarité's freedom was bittersweet. On the one hand, she had achieved what many slaves could only dream of, the recognition of her humanity and the right to decide her own destiny. On the other, she knew that that same destiny remained uncertain. Rosette's safety depended on her remaining in the orbit of Valmoraine, who still saw her as an essential part of his daily life. Although she was no longer his slave legally, the invisible shackles of power and control still weighed heavily on her heart. The promise of freedom for Rosette was just that, a promise that Valmoraine might or might not keep, depending on his own whim. Zarité, though free on paper, understood that she still had to fight. The life she wanted for her daughter was one where chains did not exist, where Rosette could live without the shadow of slavery marking her destiny. And yet, that vision of the future felt distant, almost unattainable. Zarité knew that her freedom would not be complete until Rosette was also free. The declaration of her freedom, so long awaited, became a new challenge, an internal struggle between her duty as a mother and her personal desire to leave the plantation and Valmoraine behind forever. Part 5. The Dance of Freedom. Finally, after years of struggle, sacrifice, and pain, Zarité took control of her destiny. She had survived the worst that life could offer her: slavery, abuse, loss. However, she now held in her hand something that, for so long, had been an impossible dream: freedom. Valmoraine, her former master, had signed her release, a belated gesture that did not erase the scars of her past life, but at least gave her the opportunity to decide for herself. With Gambo, the man who had loved her with unwavering devotion, Zarité began to build a new life. The two, united by a love forged amidst violence and chaos, set out for a new stage. The bond they shared was deep, not only because of what they had lived through, but because of what they both represented: the hope of a future in which the past no longer shackled them. Although the war continued around them, and the island was engulfed in the flames of revolution, Zarité and Gambo managed to find a place far from the shadows of the plantation. The freedom she now held in her hands was not just physical. Zarité understood that, although she no longer wore shackles, true emancipation was something she had to build within herself. Freedom, for her, was a state of soul, a space where she could dance under the sun, not just in her dreams, but in reality. The drums that always resonated in her heart, those echoes of her mother and of Africa, were still her guide. Those sacred rhythms, which had been forbidden by the masters, were now her most precious inheritance. She danced to the beat of those drums, feeling the connection with her ancestors, with her history, and above all, with her new life. At her side, Gambo, who had also fought for her freedom, shared her vision of the future. They both knew that the scars of the past would never completely disappear. The pain of having been a slave, of having been a mother in a world that snatched away her children, of having been used by a man who never saw her as a complete human being, was still there, deep within her. But Zarité had learned that those scars did not define her. What defined her was her ability to move forward, to find joy in the midst of suffering, to rebuild her life from the broken pieces of the past. Together with her daughter, Rosette, Zarité began to create a new home. Though the young woman had also been a slave, and the fate of the women of her race on the island was uncertain, Zarité was determined that her daughter would have a better life. In every decision she made, in every step she took, Zarité held fast to the idea that Rosette should be free, not just by the role that proclaimed it, but in spirit. For Zarité, her daughter's freedom was the final piece in her own journey toward redemption. If Rosette could live without the chains that had marked her mother's life, then Zarité would feel that her mission was accomplished. The sun shone down on them, and though the drums still echoed in her memories, Zarité no longer listened to them with sadness, but with hope. The life she had begun was hers, and though the world around her was still at war, her heart was at peace. Now she could dance, not just to escape reality, but to celebrate that, finally, she was the mistress of her own destiny. Get the book at planetalibro.com.